Welcome back to the Ways to Flourish podcast, where we discuss how to flourish through our challenges and elevate voices across William & Mary's campus. I'm Eric Garrison.
And I'm Lindsay Heck. And here today is Kelly Crace. He is the Associate VP for Health and Wellness at William & Mary. Welcome back, Kelly.
Thanks. It's great to be back.
Very glad to have you here today. And also joining us is Marrin Scalone, a wellness ambassador. I'm a big fan. Hi, Marrin. Welcome.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
So today we're going to talk about rethinking motivation and why willpower fails us. So Kelly, what is the difference between nervous energy and anxiety? Do you want to open us up?
I think the reason why this issue of motivation and nervous energy and this issue of willpower is so important at this time of year. Those of us that are on an academic calendar, this time of year is typically kind of characterized by decreased excitement and increased expectations. Because after the first of the year, everybody kind of takes stock and reevaluates what the past semester was like, what the past year is like, and they often develop quite a few personal goals for improvement and moving forward. And as they do that, they develop a large sense of expectations of themselves. The problem is also that they've been through a semester of very hard work and they come into the spring semester with their batteries not completely recharged, even though you've had a semester break. And so there's just decreased newness, decreased excitement around this. You add to that our pandemic conditions and all of the things that we have dealt with socially. It can be a time where the energy is lower and the weariness is higher. And so it comes to be this big expectation and a demand on willpower. Your question around nervous energy and anxiety and what's the difference between that, because it really has an impact on expectations, is I kind of think of it as the continuum of excitement, nervous energy, and anxiety. Whenever we're excited about something we're getting ready to do, there is meaning behind it. There's purpose behind it. And so we're excited about engaging. And there's a sense of confidence that we have a sense of agency of how things are going to turn out. So we feel good and optimistic that I can not only step in and act on this, but I feel like it's going to turn out well. And then you move down the continuum a little more, and that's when it's nervous energy. When I ask, how are you feeling about this? And they say, I'm nervous. There's a nervous energy whenever we move into a situation that has meaning and purpose to it, but there is a question mark as to how it's going to turn out. There's uncertainty about the outcome and what can happen from this. And with that, the doubt is more about the external situation. I'm not sure how this is going to turn out. And yet there's a sense of confidence about their abilities, that I've studied for this, I've trained for this, I'm ready to step in. I just don't know how it's going to turn out. And because of that, I'm nervous. That's also a very healthy form of motivational energy. And then it can move down the continuum where there's anxiety. And when anxiety is a part of it, what is combining here is that doubt and now is starting to become internalized to where there's starting to be a belief that I may not be enough. This matters to me. I want to do well in it. But I am starting to believe that I'm not ready or that I don't think it will turn out. And when that starts to move from a wondering to a belief, that creates a certain level of anxiety and affects our motivational energy.
Marrin, I've got a question. What does that look like from a student perspective?
Sure. I'm a junior now, and I think it's taken me a little while to sort of get comfortable and understand the student sort of grind culture, if you will. And that to me, that stress does not equate to higher productivity necessarily. And that just because I may pull an all-nighter or stay up later when trying to accomplish something, it doesn't necessarily mean that I am rooted in more purpose or that my motivation is higher. So I think it's taken me a bit, and as a student, trying to get comfortable with the fact that willpower does not have to come from a negative headspace and a pressure headspace, but it can rather come from just higher purpose and more, for me, it's time management is a big thing that comes for me for motivation, and more of a passive will than this kind of in-your-face, like grind mentality that may be common on sort of a college campus. But it's a daily task for sure.
And when we internalize that belief that we're not good enough, what are some tactics that can help to move us out of that headspace?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think to explore what we need to do, I think we also need to explore how we can get set up. how we can be misguided by certain platitudes that we're taught in our society that actually lead to ineffectiveness and ineffective motivation. When I ask students, when they come in the spring with these expectations and these new goals for the spring semester, and when I ask them, what needs to happen for you to feel good about making this actually happen in the way that you want, the most common answer is, I just need to have more willpower. I need to be more self-disciplined than I normally am. And that's a very natural human response. It's also a setup. There is this societal expectation of the importance of applying willpower. And it actually, paradoxically, leads us to an ineffective place. And we can think of two ways that happens. One is, here's the typical kind of situation. The night before, I think about what is important for me to do tomorrow. What's really important for me to devote my time and energy. And when I think of and I clarify those things, I then demand myself to say, okay, this matters to me. I'm going to get up tomorrow. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to feel really good about that. And we feel a sense of motivation in that moment. What happens, though, is when we wake up and start to actually engage in those things, we become very aware of the difficulty of it, the hardness of it, the ambivalence of it, the what ifs. What if this doesn't go well? What if I don't get this done in the time that I had allotted for it? All of the complicating factors and the ambivalence in our feelings and the expectations start to kind of result in not feeling purely motivated. So what we're actually wanting and expecting is we're expecting that surge. We're expecting that surge of motivation that I felt last night. I felt good about it. I get up in the morning, and instead of feeling the surge, I feel the ambivalence. I feel the doubt. And we blame that on our lack of willpower. And so we wait for the feeling. The essence there is they're trying to be motivated. On the other end of the continuum, also willpower can work against you because there's this hypermotivation. People that manage uncertainty and fear and worry through perfectionism, through perfectionistic tendencies, a lot of the times what they'll do is this chronic worry, this fear is what's driving their energy. But they characterize that as willpower. They characterize that as kind of a positive drive. And so they legitimize that. They legitimize constantly being in hyperdrive, constantly being worry-centered, because they've couched that as willpower, when actually what it is unsustainable intensity. There's a difference between passion and intensity. Passion is feeling towards something of purpose and meaning. Intensity is when worry and fear gets mixed in, and that combines to create something that feels like drive, but is an unsustainable level of anxiety and worry that eventually we tap out on. And that's the crash. That's the burnout crash, when we just can't sustain that.
Kelly, you were mentioning that, students and others just feel like they don't have enough of various things. How do we deal with that different consistency of, well, last year I had enough willpower, now I don't. 6 months from now I may have enough willpower. How do we deal with the students accepting that, not just students, any of our audience, accepting the fact that everything is not just tonic?
Yeah, it's one of the fascinating things we found in our research with working with people that more consistently flourished. We all flourish and we all languish. There's always that ebb and flow. But with people that we studied that more consistently flourished, especially around the area of motivation, we found that they shifted how they thought about motivation. And for many of us, we punctuate our motivation or lack thereof as a very personal statement. We get very personal and very judgmental to where at the end of the day, we look back and kind of reflect on where we weren't as engaged as we thought we should be. And we personalize that as some kind of flaw. I just don't have self-discipline, or I need to have more willpower. In fact, the shift that occurs among consistent flourishers, it's a shift from trying to be motivated to trying to understand their motivation. They get very curious. Instead of judgmental, they move into this wondering mode. And they try to understand their motivation as to how it exists right now in their life, allowing for that kind of ebb and flow that can happen. So examples of more deeply understanding motivation is they understand kind of the sources that drive motivation. There are 4 things that inform motivation. That's our thoughts, feelings, energies, and our abilities. So our thoughts can include our values, our beliefs, our expectation, just our clarity of thinking on a particular day, which can ebb and flow. Our feelings are our emotions around this. And emotions, how do I feel about this thing that I'm getting ready to do? And energy is a part of it. We have high energy days and we have low energy days. One day we may be sick or tired or sick and tired of all of this Groundhog Day effect, this COVID fatigue. Our energy may be impacted, and that will inform it. And it's about also looking at our abilities. At times when we're just getting ready to start off with something and we feel we kind of are at a low skill level and we see this huge learning curve that's getting ready to take effect, that can affect our sense of motivation. Here's the interesting thing. If all four of those things are moving in the same direction, you don't even think about motivation. You just are. But if I have to even think about being motivated, that means at some level, one or more of those four things are swimming up current. And what they try to do is understand that. They try to understand what are the things that are swimming up current. What are my conflicting thoughts? What are my conflicting feelings? Am I in a values conflict? That part of me is motivated this way, but part of me is motivated toward this other right. They really try to understand that. And then they kind of go more deeply in terms of seeing what is my natural motivation and what is the purest motivation. Our most natural motivators are fear and comfort. That's the most natural motivation we have. So we're wired for crisis and regulation. So we'll wake up in the day and we start living according to what are the have-tos, what are the urgent crises of the day, and then we seek comfort. So it's have-tos and comfort. But the purest form of human motivation are our values, but only if you have a relationship with them. So one of the things they shift from is they move from what my values are, which are kind of this categorical, conceptual thing, to how are my values alive in my life? In other words, they turn to this deeper form of motivation, which is about meaning. Our purest form of energy is derived from meaning. It's also our most sustainable form of energy. Meaningless energy is unsustainable. So if I do something out of fear or if I do something out of comfort, I can do it in the moment, but I cannot sustain that over time. They move to this deeper level of understanding about their values and their expectations and the meaning around those things from their thoughts, feelings, and energies and abilities. So they can just tell you, just very crystallized each day, what their motivation looks like. And that kind of deeper understanding works better than trying to beat yourself into this level of self-discipline and willpower, which is very critical and very harsh and very judgmental.
And everything goes back to the values, and this is just a reoccurring theme. So how can we begin that journey to identify those most immediately when it comes to applying them to our motivation?
One of the things that I would love to hear from Marrin on is, as a wellness ambassador, so much of her time has been looking at values and looking at fear and kind of trying to think about how do we bring this into the culture from a motivational standpoint, thinking about, instead of values in terms of ethics and morality, thinking about it in terms of motivation, thinking about it in terms of how do we sustain ourselves to keep from burning out. And I have a few tips and things that I would like to share, but I would also love to hear from the wisdom of our wellness ambassadors and our students, especially Marrin. And she's done some amazing things this past year that have been a little non-traditional and a little different, but it's been based on meaning. And Marrin, do you mind sharing some of those with us before we get into some of the tips?
Sure. So yeah, it's been a strange meaning year, I think, for everyone. But the fall semester of 2020, sort of after things happened and life got pretty crazy, I made this decision out of trying to find some meaning and some more purpose. And I ended up moving and doing remote coursework in a little island in South Carolina and just spending some time to try and find some meaning and to try and write a book that I've been sitting on for a couple years. And that experience taught me very, very many things, but a lot of things I didn't know would be so applicable back in Williamsburg and back in a more traditional student setting. And I think for me, I feel very lucky that I have a lot of that passion, and I've been able to sort of hone in on that over my life as a student, and that's not something that is usually limited for me, but I feel like that's a similar student experience. And that's what I love about the students of William & Mary is walking on the street, of walking around campus. If I walked up to someone and asked, like, why are you here? What is your major? At this school, a major usually implies what that person is really passionate about. And those conversations are wonderful. But lately, and especially during the pandemic, that can be overwhelming. And I can feel like I'm trying to live several lives at once. And I think, in this current climate, I try and be very intentional about balancing my short-term and my long-term perspectives, and that I do have that long-term goal, that long-term dream that is career-oriented or meaning-oriented in those values. But I try and acknowledge when my short-term tank needs to be filled before I can attend to those goals and to those values. And that looks like, even if I have to put something off that I thought would be accomplished by now, that can look like going to College Creek with my roommates because I just know I need that, or short term is going for a walk with my dog, or just those things that may not necessarily look like the big picture, big value passion projects, but it will get me there faster in the end. So that's been a lesson for me, I think, that I've learned through this year.
Oh,
Yeah, I love that. And it just,
beautiful.
it really leads into kind of some of the things that when we've really looked at, well, how conceptually that makes sense in terms of trying to move from being motivated to understand motivation. That conceptually makes sense. But how do you actually do that? How do you actually practice that? And when we looked at people that consistently flourish, there's actually some tips, some daily intentionalities that they're very mindful about. One of the first ones is one that I've just seen and heard Eric and Lindsay talk about all the time when they work with students. Lindsay, in your training of the wellness ambassadors, and Eric, your work with flourishing, you talk a lot about starting with why, starting with your why. And what we find is people that more consistently flourish, they start their day with meaning. They ask themselves, what matters today? And of that, what matters most? They prioritize. They not only crystallize what matters in that day, but they prioritize it. And what that does is it actually moves you from being emotion-centered to value-centered. The demand for willpower usually results in kind of this very personal, am I feeling it right now? Am I feeling that drive, or am I not feeling it? Or am I reducing my worry by hyper-driving? That's a very emotion-centered way of living. Emotions are wonderful things. Sometimes they are our first forms of awareness. It's an amazing part of our human existence. But it has to also be in its right perspective. When we're value-centered, it allows us to feel emotions fully, but not be defined by them or not be overly guided by them. So when we lead with our values, there's no emotional neutrality in that at all. We feel strongly when we're leading with our values. When we lead with our values and lead with what is meaningful today for me, there's an ownership of something. You're tapping into that deeper form of motivation. So they start with what matters today, and of that, what matters most. The second thing they move into is they think a little differently about confidence, and they rely more on volitional confidence. Volitional confidence is actually confidence by choice, and if you take away the technical meaning of it, it basically means this: when feeling can't, what of this can I do? And they commit to that. Not what else can I do, but what of this can I do? So in this understanding of motivation, when they actually step into something of meaning, if they find themselves backpedaling for, I can't do this, don't want to do this, I thought I was going to be ready to dive into this at 10 o'clock at night and I'm exhausted. And so you start thinking of other things to do. In that moment, they will stop and say, what of this can I do? And it might turn out to be 10 minutes. I'm going to do a brain dump for 10 minutes. Here's the interesting thing. Every time we step into can, when feeling can't, it changes how we process fear. Because what you've done in that moment is, instead of leading with your feelings, you've led with purpose. And that changes how we process fear and worry and our emotions. It puts them in its sweet spot. So they work with themselves. What of this can I do with what I have to give today? Today I may be at 50%. So at 50%, what can I give to this thing of purpose? On days when it's 100%, they just appreciate that. They just appreciate that. The third thing they do is they courageously honor the fight. Instead of waiting to feel motivated, waiting to feel that surge and that wonderful purity of motivation, they understand their motivation well enough to know where it's going to be hard. And they honor the hard. They honor the fight. So if in my morning I've looked at my thoughts and feelings around this purpose and I realize I actually have a lot of ambivalence about this. I kind of want to do this, but I also think it's right to do this. And they courageously prioritize and say, I'm going to choose this today. They have to recognize that there's not going to be a purity of emotion because of the ambivalence. There's not going to be a purity of motivation. So they see it as a fight. I'm going to fight to this thing that matters to me. Not they don't use the term just at all. They honor I'm not just going to do this. I'm going to fight to do this. And that's where the true concept of courage comes in. They activate courage because essentially courage is doing something personally right that's hard. Anytime we step into something that's right and hard, that's being courageous. So they honor the fight when it's hard. They also really appreciate it when it's easy. So at times when I'm going to step into this and I am just looking forward to it, I'm excited about it, I feel completely ready for this, they don't skim over that. They, at the end of the day, really reflect and value and appreciate those days when it was easy. They honor it when it's hard. They accept it when it's hard, but they also take time to appreciate when it's easy. And being able to do that is important. The last two things they do is they're really much more accurate about the language they use for themselves and when they talk with others. We're in a time right now where it's very easy for us to use extreme language to describe how we're feeling. So we hear a lot about, we're exhausted. How are you doing? We're emotionally exhausted. We see articles all the time, how to manage the pandemic through emotional exhaustion, that type of thing. We'll hear students say, I'm depressed, I'm burned out, I'm anxious, I'm panicked, I'm traumatized, all of those things. And at times, what we're really trying to do is try to show kind of how extreme I'm feeling. In a stress glorification culture, that becomes the norm. If being overstressed is the norm, then the only way I can really get people to pay attention to how I'm feeling is I've got to kind of take it to extremes. The unfortunate consequence of that, though, is it really devalues the experience of those that truly are managing clinical depression, that truly are traumatized, that truly are managing a mental health condition that is actually exhausting for them. What we found that people that flourish is they really more accurately assess and describe how they're feeling. So they'll say, I'm tired, instead of I'm exhausted, or I'm sad, I'm worried. They'll be accurate, but there is never a neutral impact on our system when we use language. So if I say to myself, Eric asked me, how are you doing today, Kelly? And I say, I'm tired. That impacts me differently than if I say, I'm exhausted. My system, my motivational energy will be deeply impacted by that. They also use ownership language. Whenever we use have to, need to, can't, worry and fear are leading. What they do instead is they use ownership language of, I choose to, this is right for me to, this is right for me not to. We found that there's a big difference in resilience just by the phrasing of these two sentences. I have to work on this project that's due at noon versus I choose to work on this project that's due at noon. The reality is not any different. The project's due at noon. But what is different is when we use ownership language, it moves from resentment to resilience, from anxiety to nervous energy with a level of confidence. The last thing they do, which I think is really important, is they constantly think about optimizing their expectations. They're constantly adapting their expectations. So what we started off with our goals at the beginning of the semester, we're far enough into the semester now where there needs to be some adaptation, some optimizing of expectations. The reason we use the term optimizing expectations is because a lot of students will hear this as lowering my expectations, that if I have to change my expectations from January, what I'm basically doing is lowering my standards, and I have a real problem with that. Instead, what we're talking about is optimizing our expectations so that we find that optimal level of motivational energy that we can sustain. But those are just some of the things that we've noticed and observed from our research with people that consistently flourish that they are mindful about. They don't naturally do this. They work at it. They're very intentional about doing this every day because of the importance of it. Marrin, how does all this land on you? When you hear these, what do you see around you and yourself with these tips and strategies that you think may be relevant?
Well, I can't help but think of the many conversations we've had about me being like, I want this to go really well. And then you ask me, okay, what does well mean? I'm like, I don't know. Good, I guess. And I think about that often. I thought about my experience on transitioning from being a remote student right now to coming back to Williamsburg. That was certainly an active practice in what expectation means for me. And there was a lot of anxiety around that. But I think that what I think about most is the kind of practice of understanding and getting comfortable with the fact that discomfort doesn't necessarily mean I'm doing something wrong, and trying to get comfortable with being uncomfortable about certain things, and that like intrinsic pressure or just uncomfortable feeling doesn't mean that I'm doing anything incorrectly. And it also doesn't mean that I actively am in any sort of threat and need to change that if just I'm uncomfortable. So that can be a growing pain or a process. And I've certainly had my fair time of uncomfortable transitional periods throughout my time here, especially this year. And I think that that's something that's been important for me, is expectation of like good doesn't mean not difficult. And that difficult can be part of an expectation, and it can still be a positive and looking forward to kind of anticipation.
Marrin, I've got a question for you. Since you're closer to the K through 12 experience than some of the others of us are, although I've got some parents sitting across from me, what are some tips or tricks that you wished maybe you had learned prior to coming here? As teachers, we, teach how to, conjugate Greek and how to do quadratic formulas and all these other things. But what about these life skills? What would you have liked to have learned K through 12 that could have prepared you for some of these pieces that we're facing right now?
Man, well, I would have loved to see the word resiliency or flourishing anywhere in any of my public school education. And that's something I hope to work on just in my adult life, of trying to bring resiliency training into the public education system. But on a more specific scale, I wish I had learned how fluid life is and that you're not trapped. I'm a transfer student, and I didn't understand that was even possible before I learned how to transfer. And so I think my middle school and high school experience was a good portion of it was, what do you want to be when you grow up? Where do you want to go to college? And then people had definitive answers. And I think embracing change, and that would have probably helped me understand that transitional periods and growth periods are really great. And that I wish that that was a little bit more of a message in K through 12 years for me, was that it's okay to retry things, and it doesn't mean failure. It just means that it's a process.
One of the things I love about what Marrin said is it brings up one of the most tragic expectations that our society kind of builds, especially in K through 12, is the expectation for linearity. And that's the same thing that the demand for willpower does, is the demand for willpower and self-discipline creates this kind of unintentional demand for linearity. And so from students that have to get into the right school to then get into the next level of school to then provide the opportunities, there's this demand that everything should be linear. And with those expectations, it requires a tremendous amount of stress management, and it just drains us. It's not sustainable. Being able to challenge that expectation and recognizing that our lives are nonlinear and that that's okay, and that the detours can be a learning opportunity. And also seeing how K through 12 is starting to get it at some level. We're finding students that are coming to W&M Mary that have said, I've been doing mindfulness since middle school. I've been doing yoga since elementary school. And they're coming here expecting advanced mindfulness, advanced yoga, which I just think is a wonderful statement.
Well, Kelly, based on that and based on Marrin's insights, people who are flourishing, what are they doing differently?
A lot of it is about paradigm shifting.
Okay.
A lot of it is recognizing they still live in a world where outcomes matter. People that flourish don't deny the reality of outcomes. They don't deny the pressures that are around them and the evaluations that are occurring around them. They feel all of that. They just recognize that the only thing I can control within this is me, is my brain and my mindset as I'm approaching this. So while feeling this ambivalence, while feeling this nervous energy, how do I work best with myself? So they're constantly in this place of curiosity and wonder rather than judgment and evaluation, rather than ending every day with what didn't get done today and what I need to do to make up for it tomorrow. They end every day with what can I learn from today that'll help me for tomorrow? They're constantly in this place of wonder. And then they're constantly moving into this place of trust in themselves, trust that them with their values and applying their energy toward that is absolutely enough. And that's just more sustainable over time.
And even with people focused on their values, is it possible to be overmotivated?
Yes. I mean, that hyperdrive, that overmotivation is really when the combination of values and fear unmanaged values and fear, which means with these values, this matters to me. I should just be able to go with this. but there's a recognition that there's uncertainty here. And how they manage that uncertainty is either through avoidance with procrastination or through perfectionistic control. And when it moves into perfectionism, that's when that hyperdrive kind of comes into play. And they kind of legitimize that as a positive thing of passion or willpower, when really what it is unsustainable intensity that eventually starts to get in the way of your best performance and just wears you out.
Do you mind if I add something to that?
Please.
I think that definitely speaks to me. I think that I've had to learn the OverMotivated Gauge, which is not something that 5 years ago me would think I would have ever had to learn. So that kind of feels like a win, but it's also not. Like it's a spectrum, and I don't want any sort of over or under kind of parts of motivation. And so for me, I think a way that I gauge if I am being overly motivated is how capable I am of being present in that day. If I find myself completely out of my day and just looking 3 years in the future, 4 years in the future, and just really leaning on that, then I feel maybe it's time to step back a little bit. And that even though that is coming from a passion place and from a really meaningful and positive place, it's still important to me to hold that presence in kind of my life and daily going about who I am right now as a person. So that's a good way that I find I can gauge over motivation.
That's a great example of one of the principal components of flourishing is a commitment and an acceptance of constantly catching and recovering. People that flourish don't always just have that perfect mindset, but this is why it's advanced mindfulness, is when they drift, when they worry, when their mind takes off on them toward the future, because that's what worry is about. It's always future oriented. They'll catch that and recover. So they may jog down a worry road for a while, but they remember to jog back and bring it back into the present and stay focused on that. And that's hard, but it's worth the hard.
So this is for both of you. If our audience was trying to learn more about motivation or flourishing in general, where would they go? What would they do?
I think there's some great resources that our wonderful colleagues in student affairs have developed, both from their departments and within our virtual wellness site and our wellness website and our wellness apps, has just a breadth of resources that are available that can speak to different kinds of motivation. Someone may be struggling with motivation because of their anxiety, and there are resources to go for that. Some may be struggling with motivation because they're worn out, because they're driving themselves so hard that they're not having any restorative time. And there are restorative opportunities and programs and activities and events. Sometimes their motivation can be restored by going and having some fun or going and exercising, and there's wonderful things to do there. There are both strategies and workshops that they can attend that can help with that. There's also an open educational resource it's called lifevaluesinventory.org, which is an open educational resource that's free and available that helps people kind of develop their relationship with their values, but also has tips and strategies of how this relates to motivation. I think one of the biggest things that I loved what Marrin said, one of the biggest challenges, but one of the most important challenges, is to really shift from a maximization principle to an optimization principle. Fear and worry is what drives us to be maximum in everything. This demand for linearity drives us to be maximum, when actually you want to think about what is an optimal level of functioning. I use the metaphor that exists a lot among elite sprinters. So those in our audience that are track athletes and elite sprinters, they know of this concept already. But one of the biggest challenges for sprinters is learning what is the optimal level of effort of where I'm fastest. And it's never at 100%. They have learned that if I give 100% effort in this moment, I'm tensing certain muscles that actually slow me down. So they start to work to where, for me, I'm fastest at about 85% effort. That's because certain muscles are relaxed, certain muscles are tense, and I'm faster that way. We have to do the same thing with studying and relating and health and taking care of ourselves. What's an optimal level of sleep? Not a maximum level of sleep. What's an optimal level of exercise? What's an optimal level of studying before it just really starts working against me?
Marrin, 2 tips or tricks from you from a student perspective?
Yeah, I think that, not to flash my wellness ambassador badge or anything, but I think that having conversations with other students has really helped me figure out what my own meaning of motivation is, and like what Kelly said, what my speed is. That has been really helpful for me, and just speaking just very organically, having what may be clunky conversations about what is really not working for you right now. Here's what's not working for me. And it may be completely different answers for each other, but finding that insight with other people's experiences definitely makes me more available and comfortable with my own, and it helps me understand myself better. So I would say conversations with other students for sure.
So Kelly and Marrin, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time and all the wisdom that you have to share.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation. Appreciate the time.
And thank you to our sponsor, United Healthcare, for the support of this podcast. Ways to Flourish is produced by Brittany Emmons, Colin Cross, Lindsay Heck, Jenny Hellmandaler, Ben Heath, Daria Moody, and me, Eric Garrison.